if there's one thing I can definitely say is that fasting was a central piece to those ancient civilizations. And I think it's something that you needed out of necessity, as you didn't have hospitals, antibiotics, CAT scanners, etc. Or at least I don't think they did. And if I can get 80% of my patient volume from the ER out of the ER through prevention and through a practice of fasting that also is healing your body and your soul at the same time, it must have been a different world. It must have been a different world, but it probably had less sorrow and suffering than what we have now.
Welcome to the Consciousness of the Way. I am your humble servant and seafood Taoist Master San Qing. And what an incredible guest here today. I'm very excited to have a conversation with a new friend to the podcast, Dr. Patitsas, who is a facet of many things. Let's just start with the doctor, which is a creation of the union of human and the science that can be related to healing in many different ways. He's a fasting expert and a spiritual explorer, in my opinion. I mean, he can define that himself. But welcome to the podcast, my dear friend.
Hey, thanks, Sam. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate you making time for me as we bridge time zones and that sort of thing. So thanks for making the time.
Yes, I mean, it's very exciting. You had me at hello, all the exciting things I love to speak on and expand on what we consider within Taoism. The teacher is the student is the teacher. When you accept you know nothing, you know everything. So it always starts with that seed of inquiry. So furthermore, how about we start for the audience, giving you a little brief journey of how you got here to however you want to share it with the audience.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, maybe take a slightly different approach than I have historically on the introduction, just given your background. But in general, I think we all have ego. And I think one of the beautiful things about objectivity and the measurable world is that we can sort of harness our ego based on fact. Or at least I think that's the premise. It's kind of like you might think that you're X, Y, and Z, but at the same time, you have to prove it. And there's sort of a physical world to suggest that maybe your sense of reality is accurate. And one of the reasons I bring that up as I introduce the topic of fasting is that, we can have many different theories or many different feelings as to how things should be or could be, but then we try to prove, what we are promoting through some type of literature search, scientific inquiry, testing, etc. And that can get a little bit limited because, as we're trying to maybe examine the Lord of the Rings Tolkien's book, I could start at the beginning of the ink to the paper, and I noticed when he makes these caricatures a certain way, it forms these things called words, and then the word sentences and paragraph, and eventually you talk about this whole story called Lord of the Rings, which obviously is very powerful, but that doesn't really, you can't really study the top from examining the ink and the paper that story is being written on. And that breaking down of the whole into pieces can sometimes lose that synergy, that emerging something that comes from that. So somehow I feel like in a certain way throughout history, we have sort of this minimizing way talking about the simplicity of ancient peoples and the minds and the uneducated nature of those civilizations, and poor them, and thank God for us in 2024. But the reality is that I think as we try to examine the wisdom that is what that emerging story becomes, that wisdom, it's nice in 2024 to be able to break things apart to their basic components to kind of verify and build some trust. There's some value in that, and I think we all have to keep that in mind. But at the same time, that really shouldn't prevent us from exploring what truly that wisdom is, that we've been passing on for good reason. And I always find it ironic as we move into, let's say the next epoch of modern civilization, all the digitization and the hunger, and basically the intoxicity of knowledge that we pursue just for the sake of all the data you can take. It's always more the merrier. It's not really the case. I think what ends up happening is as you get sort of overwhelmed and drunk on the data, you can really miss the forest from the trees. And so for me, I think fasting is that sort of ultimate tool that, when aimed in the right way, can get you a lot of amazing result. And I'll go back to introducing myself, but just to say that the high level here is that 80% of all disease that we struggle with in America, and there's plenty of them, is entirely preventable. And so if that's the case, there's something in the data that we're missing, because the outcome that we're dealing with right now is a very sick population of people that probably is no coincidence are not directed with the proper center and the proper center of gravity. And I think when you can finally take the data and align that towards a goal, you can achieve all sorts of amazing things. But there's something akin, I guess we'd call it wisdom, we maybe call it tradition, we maybe call it just human thriving. But it always, I think, starts with sort of a spiritual framework. And so what I have come upon, given my background, and my background as a medical doctor who gets to explore the data and explore the facts, but also a spiritual human being that was raised Greek Orthodox and has been fasting since I was 7. And I'm 40 now. I just got back from the Inca Trail in Machu Picchu to celebrate my 40th birthday, which was amazing. We can talk about just how ancient wisdom just blows you away in the face as you're looking just at something as simple as stonework in a place that was forgotten, and technique that we can't reproduce today. But from those two prongs of, let's say, a traditional wisdom that's sort of passed on and oftentimes resisted or maybe even forgotten in the modern day, and then take that with some medicine to sort of say, hey, maybe there's something here that we need to explore and validate. From these two prongs, we kind of arrive at a new center, which is something like fasting is just an extraordinary tool for healing of both soul and body. And I always like to ask myself, before there was a Judeo-Christian historical timeline, how did God interact with human civilization for, depending on what you want to say, millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years? And I think if there's one thing I can definitely say, is that fasting was a central piece to those ancient civilizations. And I think it's something that you needed out of necessity, as you didn't have hospitals, antibiotics, CAT scanners, etc. Or at least I don't think they did. And if I can get 80% of my patient volume from the ER out of the ER through prevention and through a practice of fasting that also is healing your body and your soul at the same time, it must have been a different world. It must have been a different world, but it probably had less sorrow and suffering than what we have now. So that's that's how I would kind of start the conversation, to say that I'm a doctor in the ER with a very spiritual sense of grounding in a Greek Orthodox Eastern Christian tradition, and I've sort of come full circle to try to share best practices of this faith that might actually just be tapping into, let's say, an even more universal practice that predates a lot of those traditions. So.
Yeah, I mean, that is amen to that, my dear friend. I'm starting off with something that is quite exciting. The inquiry, the exploration that you have, of course, the seed of knowing, maybe perhaps through your own discovery as a young boy, or perhaps maybe it was just part of your family's tradition and connection with God that brought you to this ancient realization. But I would agree that I would even bump that number up more to a 90 plus percentile, that people are not even aware of their insulin resistance, and more commonly what people refer to as metabolic disorder, because as you go down the rabbit hole of what that really means. And furthermore, when it became really popular back in the late 80s, early 90s, autoimmune disease, I mean, come on now. We are looking at the body consuming itself to some degree, and the breakdown of the power of your energy potential, quite frankly, the mitochondria. That is really what we're talking about. How is that taking place? How are we getting deep into the core of your energy? From a Taoist perspective, we call it the Jing, the constitution that you are born into this world from the primordial womb and realized as human flesh and blood, which gives you this baseline of what is potential, which could be, hereditary disposition, gene expression, what you're made of, where you came from, your your ancestors and how they came together to give you what you have right now. But I mean, understanding that would be furthermore a discovery of what you can and can't do, which is quite frankly within my space, nothing. I've seen it all. In 30 years, I've seen any and every type of supernatural, supernormal miracle that comes in the form of, the first thing I saw was gangrenous flesh turning back to pink in color in 40 minutes. And that was the beginning of my ride of exploration. And what witnessing healing, mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, is just something that I come across every day. And when you get down into things that are more measurable from a paranormal or parapsychologist level or metaphysical level, we measure these things in the form of precognition and remote viewing, things that can be identified and measured in a scientific setting. This is very real. This is not a figment of people's imagination.
I mean, the stakes are very high. So from a medical perspective, or specifically a doctor who works in the trenches, and I like to say, we ER docs are a rare breed. There's like 15 of us per 100,000 in the population in the United States. And it's a fairly new tradition in the sense that I think it was only like in the 1960s that it even became a board certified specialty. But the reality is that, there are people all over the world that need help. And what we're trying to do is reproduce best practices so that people can alleviate their sorrow and suffering wherever they are, no matter what condition that they're dealing with. And so the discussion in sort of medical tradition is, hey, anecdotally I noticed X, Y, and Z, and as I sort of replicate that, whether it's just as simple as washing your hands, right? You don't need a study to kind of understand the inner mechanics of hygiene, but if it's just soap and water, let's use that all over the world. Let's see what happens. And let's see all the things that we can prevent. Very interesting. But at the same time, I think what you can do to pervert that in the best case, you take that anecdotal cases and you find a trend and you start reproducing that, you get better and better outcomes. At the same time, if we all just started breaking apart, what is it? The suds? Is it 15 seconds? Is it 20 seconds? Is it, we can kind of get overwhelmed in the minutia. And so I think there definitely has to be a balance in that exploration and in that application, because again, we don't have enough time to figure out what active molecule there is within the practice. Let's say I'm trying to go from this specific case to all of them because there's just so much good that could be done. And at the same time, we don't want to infiltrate those practices with something that might be a poison that now suddenly we're spreading, more harm than good. I think about chemotherapy. I mean, I think that's something that, is obviously effective, but at the same time, inherently just feels like something we're probably getting wrong. I wouldn't be surprised in years to come, we start to realize there's something there that we could have done better. But just to say is that, we as a society are trying to do the best that we can, because when it comes down to it, we don't want our children dying at birth. We don't want mothers dying from blood loss delivering. We don't want our grandparents dying of heart attacks. And at the same time, we want people to be as functional and apt as possible every day of their lives so we can bring more good to the world. And so it's not just about, reducing harm, but also allowing people to be in a state where they can do as much good as possible. And so I think that's the true mission of medicine. And we need whatever tools that we can use towards that. And sometimes it's a humble practice, a meek practice like fasting that can make all the difference. And one of the most powerful realizations I had, I mean, it was almost like induced me to weep, was just this idea. I think about this passage of God on the cross, saying, God, why have you forsaken me? But he hasn't forsaken us. It's like 80% of all disease can be prevented if we would just kind of pick up our cross and walk and do the right things. And we don't. And so, we have to make sure we haven't positioned ourselves in a state of self-exile where we're just kind of suffering for the sake of. Speaking of Peru, there is a famous story of some rugby players that crashed a plane in the mountains of Peru, but I think back in the 70s. And this case is really famous because it was just so extreme, but it's brought up in like every ethics class, every MBA class, Masters of Business. I got a degree, and I remember we went through this case, and they kind of framed the whole thing as, well, what would you do if your plane crashed? You didn't know when help would come, and you're 2 weeks in and you're starving. Who do you eat first? Like how do you ethically get through that? Is it justified? And I remember just saying, at the very end of this discussion, like, guys, they were saved because there was someone who refused to participate in that practice, literally walked out of the plane and found help. And so if they had just done that on day 2 versus day whatever it was, 20, there's so much that they could have avoided. And so that sometimes I think our principles really save us if we're just courageous enough to pursue them. I have other examples too, where that really is highlighted. But I just have to say is that sometimes I think that we have the cures, we just don't want to put in the work, and we don't want to sacrifice other things we might even value more, unfortunately, and it comes at the expense of our souls and bodies for sure.
Yeah, I would agree. People get caught up in, it's a very interesting blend right now. Information being the currency of seeking your answer to many things. And YouTube is a vehicle, the second largest search engine in the world. Most people will find an answer for something there, and there'll be many different talking heads propagating stuff that may potentially be not of any value or some value or a lot of value. And I feel like that's part of your discernment, is to be able to identify that furthermore through application. So, fasting, as you know, I have had a relationship with it for over 40 years. It's a fantastic tool to harness and balance your endocrine system. Furthermore, there could be side effects depending upon how you're starting it, where you're at in your baseline of your own body's ability to adapt. Sure. So are you sick? Are you well? What is your homeostasis, and where are you starting from? In most cases, probably 80 or 90% of people that I come across that are in my path of wanting healing will have some evidence of some non-alcoholic fatty liver, or just an alcoholic fatty liver. There is this toxin buildup of your environment and what you're consuming that is having a very clear effect on your body's ability to process energy, i.e. food, consuming something, but to the degree of how powerful the human body is, how quickly you can adapt to your set environment, being you're inducing something, whether it's in the form of food or drugs or alcohol or whatever, you are affecting the change of this homeostasis. How powerful this vehicle is like evidence to around the world, watching people poison themselves through, traditional pathways like cigarettes, alcohol, things of that nature. You cannot be more mind blown than when you look at someone who's spent decades doing that and they're still functioning. It's wild to me. So that gives you inquiry to go, okay, well, what is the X factor that is giving them the potential to continually poison the well of wellness within the human body? And furthermore, the fastest way to harness that, I mean, I can literally give someone within 24 hours more result and change of their physiology using fasting and forms of mind, attention, intention that will give them clear evidence that it's working. I mean, I think a lot of humans not going down the path of conscious creation, just living their day-to-day life, not aware of something greater than the mundane existence, are sort of caught up in what we call, a psychologist might call it, the heteroaction. What you start, you must finish. This is furthermore the basic rat in the wheel processes of how humans are analytic, introspective, negative in their nature. It's just a fear-based sort of reality of your programming initially. You know what you know. You don't know what you don't know. You can't pass that threshold until you have absorbed more information, more data, as you put it, to validate this as being true. And so fasting is a very fast way to harness your body's, chemistry, i.e. hormonal chemistry, i.e. blood sugar levels. Now, initially, you can go 24, 48 hours, and some of the side effects are your blood sugar will raise, even though you may have issue with, insulin resistance, or potentially you may have some degree of diabetes. You've gone past that threshold. Yet, if you hold the line and you realize that you're being given guidance by said teacher, i.e. someone with your experience, your understanding, your insight from not only experience personally, but from a medical lens that can give them an understanding of how these mechanisms are working internally, you can't understand. A lot of people get blown away within 72 hours. They've literally dropped 10 or 15 pounds of unnecessary weight. Maybe it's visceral, maybe it's just fluid, but you're seeing clear evidence of your body starting to function better, and you're more alert, more aware. There's no brain fog. There is a clear evidence of change that's positive, returning them back to a state where they're in command of what's going on in their body. And so autophagy is a great threshold. Now, you could probably give the audience more insight as to what the medical community would consider the threshold of evidence of that on paper through data, or furthermore, I can tell very clearly when someone crosses over and it is clearly using fat as a fuel, as opposed to, the traditional source of energy that most people think they need to be bound by, which is, carbs. So
Yeah,
that.
yeah, interesting stuff. I mean, I always find it sort of interesting parallel between withdrawals of different types. I mean, we're talking about you were saying different poisons, but like, okay, you see liver cirrhosis, for instance, and you're suspecting alcohol consumption every day for years. Okay,
sugar. That's normally what it is.
But what's wild is that, as you said, non-alcoholic steatosis of the liver, that's all sugar induced usually. And it's funny to me that while someone might be picking up a beer, too many times a day, that really the liver looks no different if you're picking up too much Mountain Dew. And it's and somehow culturally we've created a culture, unfortunately, where picking up the alcohol looks worse than picking up the Mountain Dew, and then we give it to our kids to drink, and they're getting hyper, and that's cute, but that's really missing the point. Some of these things can, we wouldn't give our kids, a beer every time they're thirsty, at developing age. But with that said, though, it is a fascinating thing, as you mentioned, sort of working through that threshold and finally jumping over or getting to that line where no longer you're in sugar withdrawal. I mean, I almost find it such a funny parallel as how people feel when they're going through alcohol withdrawal and how people feel when they're going through sugar withdrawal. Like I think it's a very similar comparison. And so your body does have a second fuel, and it is in the form of breaking down fat for ketones. And that seems to be truly actually a much more longevity, friendly fuel for that matter. But yeah, it's we as a society in 2024 need to understand the power of culture. And the cultures throughout time can save us, or they can break us, or they can ruin us. I mean, I think it's something like 70% of all draft aged males can't even, clear
physical.
Yeah, they can't pass the physical for being drafted. That, as far as I can tell, that's a U.S. Security threat. You could just put it that way, and then you can translate that culture into the same one that has people with morbid obesity at 40% or more, 70% are overweight. How does that manifest into how you interact with your kids, things that you prefer to do outside, that task that you should have done that now you don't have energy for? And so you take this all and you scale it up, and you start recognizing that you can have a very sick population of people based on a culture that is not that doesn't have solidarity, consistency. I mean, why couldn't we have a culture in America where we're just, hey, we're Americans, we don't eat breakfast. We're Americans, we don't eat after 6 p.m. You know, we like to eat, you know, a lot of high protein, low carb stuff. And when we feast, we tend to break it up and change it up a little bit. And we can't wait for those days, but that's not our daily existence. And why couldn't we be proud of that? And then, wow, we're now suddenly the healthiest, long living, you know, country in the, you know, in terms of citizenship in the world. I'm attracted to the people around me. You know, I like to stay active. I mean, all of that sounds really good, you know, and so I would just say is that, again, I think the US is kind of going through a growth phase or a transition phase of like, hey, we've been around for 200 plus years, and you know, we've kind of ridden on this idea of everyone can each his own. But I guess at scale that doesn't really work out. You know, I guess at scale that's not working out, and we need to be a little bit more aware of how we need to guide the masses and guide our individual populations, so that people who don't have an intellectual, or let's say exploratory mindset, can just kind of say, well, that's just what we do. Like, everyone goes to a sauna in Scandinavia. I don't know why, we just do it. Well, there's a lot of health benefit there, and that's a cool culture, and you know, so on and so forth. But it's time, I think, in the US that we really start recognizing that the goal here is not just to be an isolated, lonely individual doing whatever you want and dying as young as you can. You know, instead, it's more like, hey, this is a collective effort to bring, you know, tides up for all people. And you know, we have to have the humility to accept best practices. And I think that's as if we have debate as to which things to pursue. You know, data can be useful, but it's the data it helps us guide to a conclusion that helps us. And it's not just there to distract us or to overwhelm us. And as long as we choose the second path of being drunk with data, you know, we'll just continue to eat at the wrong times, eat the wrong foods, and go through withdrawal, you know, unnecessarily. So it's you know, it's a high stakes game, and there's something I think we need to be intentional about to making changes in 2024. And as you mentioned, you know, things with YouTube and Google, et cetera, it's never been a better time to share those conclusions with at scale, at scope. And so it's interesting to me too. You know, there's been recently a rebirth or an interest in Eastern traditions, specifically the Orthodox Church. And many of the things that you say, you know, San, you were saying that you're the king of long podcast forms, which is great. But isn't it interesting that as we pursue what is good, what is true, what is beautiful, it takes time, and we now have a platform that actually can hold that goal, you know, mechanically, so we can participate in that, as opposed to the sound bites on mainstream TV where it's few seconds at a time, get your headline, you know, go to your McDonald's, get your fast food, instant whatever. Like, all of that aligns. Well, now we're moving towards a long form podcast, lots of discussion, lots of nuance, and truth and goodness and beauty emerge from that. I don't see it as a coincidence at all.
From my world, my dear friend, there are no coincidences. And synchronicity, serendipity, is just the side effect of the Taoist seeker turning into the knower. It's sort of like a fundamental structure of, you know, inquiry to hope, to belief system, to knowing. And that's the progression that comes through ancient practices and developing that substance we call chi, or furthermore, someone may call it prana, universe, God, Buddha, Tao. But there must be evidence of something more than what you perceive in front of you as the infrastructure. You know, on a much deeper level, if you look at a lens of this so-called reality, some of my dear friends that are NASA physicists, parapsychologists, there are scientists that are constantly measuring this phenomenon of a deeper sensory perception. And, you know, the reality is they've come to the conclusion of a holographic model of reality, that this is a virtual reality. Through their zeros and ones, their data, they have the receipts to prove to you that this is such. Now, I love when someone comes from biology, neurology, psychology, physiology, science. This is great, but it's one facet of what we call the diamond, perfection. And for you to truly embody a real knowing, which is your absolute truth. I always tell people the only absolute truth is your truth. If someone gives you the absolute truth, you need to about face and run in the other direction, because it's flawed in many aspects. There are a lot of things just in neuroplasticity and the understanding of science in of itself that, you know, I could have a very healthy conversation about the fact that I can get someone to feel the energy potential within their 50 trillion cells of that 0.07 millivolts of energetic potential, once harnessed as a maestro through these ancient indigenous practices. You will be able to feel every part of your body. Now, a scientist, a neuroscientist would say that's nonsense. You cannot feel your third eye. There is nothing there. There's nothing sympathetically innovated for me to register a response that is any evidence of that. And I can show you a map of the human body. And now that percolating effect that you're having within your thoracic area and the energy that you're feeling is a known fact that you are expanding. The chills that you're having through your body, that's a visceral, kinesthetic, somatic experience of knowing that goes beyond all the words. The simplicity of what is the truth. The truth is your glass half empty or full? That's it. You know, Tom Campbell, a dear friend of mine, a former NASA physicist, an OBE explorer and teacher for over 60 years. He helped basically create the Bob Munro Institute, which they furthermore were involved with many programs that they developed for the government and other things within consciousness, conscious and unconscious process. You experience that. You're able to validate that. And then, you know, someone will go, how do you even know I'm feeling that? Because I can see it, which is a clear sense, and I can feel it if I choose to. Now, this is just an oscillating, unified state that we're all in. Some people would call it a psychic, kinetic sort of existence. Now, this would go deeper into what we call the entanglement, furthermore, more research, 0-point energy. You know, we have a biofield. We're merging with that. It just so happens this is what we call bilocation, which doesn't seem real for most people. The fact that you're in one end of America, I'm in another, but we can sense and feel these things through our dialogue, through our linguistics, through our communication. We are now unified, which we were never not, but it's a conscious awareness, right? All of a sudden now we're like, oh, hang on a second. Well, that's crazy. How is that even possible? Well, distance healing or Shen projection has been an ancient Taoist practice for thousands of years. But furthermore, in exploring the biofield and understanding that, you know, from a psychologist's perspective, we're just creating a psychodynamic loop where we're now emerged in something and we have a consensus and we are oscillating back and forth, validating our very talking points as being real, that linguistic integrated sense of knowing that you were talking about previously, not the same subject, but I felt like you were about to touch on that. So, you know, words in of itself, people are, you know, it goes back to epigenetics, you know, the DNA strand being discovered back in the 60s, furthermore, more inquiry, more research, discovering the God code. I don't know whether you're familiar with that. You know, the deeper, yeah. Well, I'm interested. The God gene, perhaps. I'm more interested in what they discovered within that data that spoke to the word of God eternal in this body. Now, that means a lot, and it could be measured as being real or not real, depending upon the data, whether you want to believe it or not. I want to see the research, but that's been validated for many decades. And some people might, well, someone like yourself, who's a little bit more harder into the data and has a spiritual path, would want to see that to validate it as true. But you can also understand that you can feel it viscerally. You know that there is a truth to what that person speaks on, let alone the data itself. But the truth is, you know, we can be programmed. So I always tell people it's really important that you have a very clear understanding that all thoughts of your mind are not yours. And then people are like, what are you talking about? Well, conscious and unconscious process is just you being aware of your environment. Now, how you perceive it just from a peripheral level, I can implant thoughts into your mind that you think they're yours. That's just basic 101 understanding of conscious and unconscious process. So furthermore leans to the power of placebo that is always part of the formula when researching or discovering whether this drug or this therapy that you use within your medical community has any validity. That is there a measure? Why do they always use the placebo? Because it tends to have better data than the actual drug they're trying to run in of itself. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I remember watching a TED talk on the power of placebo, and I think there's even like a website where they show some really cool cases of just how effective that can be. It's kind of a wild idea. I mean, certainly there's a tradition in the Eastern Orthodox churches of sort of I wouldn't call it placebo, but it's interesting to me that, again, another phrase, let's say from New Testament is, physician, heal thyself, or do you want to be healed? And certainly in the ER, in the trenches, I can tell you that a lot of people come to the ER, they don't want to be healed. And it's not even necessarily a work thing. They're looking for explanation when we can't generate that. Now, I do know there are limits to Western medicine and science, but sometimes I literally have to come to a patient, just say, I'm really sorry, but all I can do is reassure you it's not X, Y, and Z. But I'm not really sure what the cause is, and I can also reassure you that I wouldn't let you leave my ER unless, if we thought that you needed surgery or an antibiotic, or you had some life-threatening disease. We're reaching the maximum of what we can provide you today with the technology that we have. But I'll also say, having seen numerous cases of those same patients, there does seem to be sometimes almost like they don't want to be healed. And there are incentives in their life that support that. It's funny, I think people run on we all assume that we want to run on sort of high positive energy, but negative energy is also a fuel. People sometimes like toxicity, they like drama, they like sorrow. It's funny, when people are really depressed, they cut themselves. Like, what is that all about? Like, why aren't they eating cake? Well, there's something about pain and sorrow and suffering that is an energy that some people kind of, I dare say, sort of like to have rather than nothing. And so anyway, I just go back to bring these things up to say the power of placebo. I mean, it's almost like we're tricking them into revealing what their true intentions are. And for people that want to heal, you give them a placebo, they get better. And some of these things they get better from are like really real stuff, like measurable stuff. Like they didn't get anything, but this ailment that they had improved in measurable ways. The body's very complex, and it's a wonder that we're able to do the things that we do. And I think we have to have humility to understand we don't quite grasp all the things it can do. And we've also been around for a very, very long time. And as we all kind of repeat in our own little microcosm with our own similar human nature, our own spark of divinity, you have to think that these things have been played out before. And so if we can kind of handle them 1,000,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago, we should probably be able to handle a lot of those things in 2024. Now, with that said, though, we have to make sure that there aren't bad players out there that can kind of exploit those mechanics and profit from them. But placebo is a weird thing. I mean, I think just to give you something that's not a placebo that almost seems like it should be, Pfizer, I think in 2023 made something like $40 billion in vaccines for COVID and another $20 billion selling Paxlovid. And you have to give that drug 125 times at something like $500 a day to get one person out of the hospital, like to prevent one of those people from going into the hospital. And I mean, that almost sounds like placebo right there. I mean, not even a good one. And in fact, I'm pretty sure if I did offer 125 people placebo, I probably could keep at least one or two out of the hospital. So it is an interesting thought. I mean, as I say, there's different self-declaring segments of the patient population, and some of them are just there for healing and will do what you ask, and we find things. Others just are. Others are at their fifth hospital in a day, and they're just looking for answers that are not there. And I sometimes I wonder if they just don't want to be healed. And it's a funny psychology. We see a lot of things in the ER because the mask is gone. You know, people when they're suffering and they're in pain and they're confused and they're in tragedy, they show. I don't know if I would say their true colors, but certainly they show the colors of what human nature certainly is across time, which is sometimes um, it's a lot of negative energy, and and it's something that we have to grasp with as clinicians in the ER when the stakes are so high, resources are limited, and time is limited, and it's a tough spot to be in. So just to bring us back to center, I'll just say that I think placebo is a real thing, but I think it also reveals that there's some element of self healing that we can choose to tap into or not that isn't just about putting in the work, but really about wanting to be better, and the body follows. And in a minority of cases, I think I can think of patients that really, unfortunately, follow that path of where their goal is not to be healed anytime soon, even if that therapy is available.
Yeah. I mean, the power of attention intention from a physicist perspective is the generation of energy potential in this what we perceive as material realm, mundane. You want to call it a dimension, however you want to perceive it. That is generated from your attention intention within a holographic model of the virtual reality of how people want to digest what this is. Now, for the average person, they're just dealing with the dualistic electromagnetism that is this reality. There is a polarizing effect. This is the currency, which is truly just energy. And that energy is generated from your attention intention. And I always put it to that generates from light to wave to matter to particle, a realized tangible form of energy, whether it's this can or it's a cell phone or it's I can't put it in cell phone, a seat that I'm sitting on, your flesh and blood, the ideas in my mind, they're all forms of energy. And from that energy, you create a vibration. From the vibration, you create a frequency. That frequency, if met, is a resonance. So everything is frequential in my reality, and how I teach people to validate this as being real is being able to develop these skills of resonance that said examples of manifestation, magic, healing. These are more esoteric terms that people get a little bit excited about. I always tell people I take you on a magical mystery ride of inquiry and realization of who you are. It's like I take Big Trouble in Little China, Last Airbender. They had a baby, and here is the journey of a Taoist seeker. People get excited, right? The imagination is a gateway to something more, but basically someone who's invested in pain is identifying with the heteroaction and cycle of electromagnetism. With one, there is another. There's a polarizing effect of that. Now, when you go past this state or this frequency to what more and more physicists are coming to the conclusion of, which is the evidence of black hole energy within the entanglement, which is a physicist's version of reality that was stepped on by, what's his name? Albert Einstein back in the 1920s or 30s when he discovered the bending of reality, what he calls spooky action, that gave him insight to the idea of quantum physics. And then, of course, that's been nurtured and validated through history now over 100 years, as right down to what we call a Planck unit of energy, which is one of his peers back in the day called Max Planck, who identified this currency, which most physicists would call 0-point energy, which is within all of the construct of this reality. You'll find it in the nucleus of a cell, or all the way up to planets, stars. It's at a subatomic level. It's at a macro level. There's evidence of this 0-point energy, which is basically our ability to heal instantaneously. Now, if you access that, someone would identify it as what they call a scalar wave, which when you enter into the eclipse of a black hole, all of a sudden the frequency is no longer immeasurable with this electromagnetism. So you take it, you jump it up to, I think there was a guy named David Hawkins, Stephen Hawkins. There was a guy that was writing a book on consciousness, and he had this scale. And so hertz-wise, he had it up to 1,000 hertz as being the highest level of consciousness, 963, something like that. Now, I personally measure my brainwaves and have for years. When I witness physical healing, I'm in gamma brainwave, and I hit anywhere from 40 to 400 hertz, measurable. And I will see physical flesh contort back to its original state, the default.
This is your brain frequency as you're healing a person. That's what
I'm measuring. I'm measuring it. So it to me, it doesn't hold up to, I need to hit 963 hertz to be completely conscious, which would, to the layman, have complete dominion over your consciousness, what I call imperium. You have the ability to access your conscious and unconscious at once. Now, from a brainwave perspective, when you hit gamma, you can go into alpha, theta, delta, epsilon at will. That's part of this conscious state of awareness. Most people, any neuroscientists that measure these things, and I have many friends that do it, they would validate that as being 100% conscious when you hit gamma brainwaves. Now, 5 or 10 years ago, there was only potentially 2% of the population that were capable of entering this threshold. Now, through indigenous practices, moreover, understanding the neuroplasticity aspect of connecting coherence with the brain and the heart, you create the environment. And furthermore, the gut, which comes back to this sort of universal dialogue that people have, where, I may come across someone who's a devout Christian, and they go, I don't believe in energy, or not that any one man can harness it. And then they'll have a conversation. Through that conversation, they will say, hey, I walked into a room one day and I didn't like the energy of the room. I didn't like that person, how it made me feel. And I went, aha, just 5 minutes ago, you told me you don't believe in energy, yet this is your universal form of communication or understanding of your environment. There is something there that lays down infrastructure that's been around for thousands of years, which comes back to this ancestral, like, foundational stuff. Does that make sense?
It does. And it also speaks to the power of language. I mean, if we can articulate something, I mean, sometimes it takes a generation just to find an individual who can finally put a term to a feeling or to an impression. And now we all can start using that term, and we're all like, oh yeah, that was it. I mean, I think it's one of the things that Jordan Peterson has become so famous for, is that he oftentimes gives us the jargon and the terminology to kind of speak to the something that we felt all the time. It was always there, and he's very precise with his words. And so it doesn't mean that the things before didn't exist. I mean, you meet a beautiful lady, you don't know her name yet, she still exists, but we find her name, and suddenly we become a little bit more able to recall and connect and develop a relationship, And so I think to some extent what you're speaking to is the ability to articulate what is felt. And it's amazing. It's amazing that engineering is there within the body, despite whether or not we're aware or able to articulate it or not. I mean, what in some ways that speaks to the objectifiable reality that is there, no matter what our education is, no matter what our training might be, it still remains. And one of the things that's amazing about fasting, it's kind of like that. Your dog fasts when it gets sick. Does it know why it's doing that? It just sort of feels the urge. And I guess if we told a dog that thing that you're doing is called fasting, it probably would just keep fasting. But in some ways it matters, in some ways it doesn't. The chemistry, the engineering, the physiology remains regardless. It's almost like if culturally people fast, let's just say we got a whole group of people to fast, no matter if they knew that was something or not. I mean, they're still getting that physiological benefit. They just might think of it as just something we do. So thank God there's a creation that is structured in such a way that we still get benefit, whether or not we've kind of consciously accepted the fact or not and can articulate it. So this kind of goes back to the center point of the power of fasting and the inquiry of it, is that, I discovered I practiced something that I personally didn't really understand why I was doing it at 7, for sure. Maybe eventually someone might have used the terms, yeah, this is for discipline, this is self-denial, delayed gratification, which are very powerful things to learn. And I think as a young child, those are our formative years. And I'm sure we could talk to a child psychologist to show why that is. But something about your childhood has huge impact on the rest of your life, for better or for worse. I don't know if you're familiar with the ACE study. I think actually came out of Australia, if I remember, but they were trying to determine why there was this segment of the population that was dying like 20 years earlier than everyone else, and why they were abusing drugs, and why they were divorce rates, unemployed, psychiatric illness, terrible, terrible things. And the common denominator, I'm sort of talking about it from the reverse. It actually was just them, tracking children from a young age. But what they did is they found out that if you had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, it's basically a death sentence. And these adverse childhood experiences were not just having been assaulted, but witnessing assault, witnessing crime, witnessing evil. It was enough rounds of just a slaughter of the mind at that young age that it basically destined them for really bad outcomes later on in life. So here's a child, doesn't really know what's going on, can't articulate everything, but the mere witnessing of evil manifests later on in their life as a very, very poor outcomes. And I've actually used that same science to show why a lot of ER docs are like 400% more likely to commit suicide than the normal population, because I think we witness just so much tragedy, and some of that comes in the form of domestic abuse, crime, putting a 2-year-old dies in your arms. I mean, just really rough stuff. And that takes a toll on you. The body keeps the score. Reality remains. The engine of all of this continues, no matter if we can articulate it or not. Now we create a study called the ACE study. We might have a better sense of how that's all going about. But these are realities that we can't game. And in the case of what I'm describing, the stakes are quite high. So yeah, I think what you're describing is you use these various terms to describe stuff that people should recognize regardless if they have the terminology or not. I went into a room, I felt something wrong or evil, or I just didn't want to be there. It speaks to something that eventually, I hope, science is able to catch up with, and I use the phrase catch up with intentionally, to show measurably that these people aren't just out of their minds. And of course, then, just to be balanced, certainly I meet people in my ERs who are psychotic, who are very confused, who are disoriented and delirious. Sometimes that's from, mineral issues or infection issues or et cetera. Some systems gone wrong, but sometimes it can be very, inorganic, as in it's just psychiatric. And we don't really have good tools to deal with that, by the way. I mean, the best thing I do in the ER is I overwhelm them with chemical restraints, and I have them sleep it off for 12 hours. And thankfully they haven't beaten up too many people. And then eventually I remove the chains literally from their arms and legs as I build more trust with them, and they're doing better. But yeah, it's something we should take seriously, and we should have the humility to continue to explore as to why those intuitions exist, because I think they're powerful.
This speaks on what I basically refine reality using 3 ingredients: a thought, a feeling, and an emotion. That's the currency of everything that exists in your past, present, or future. That's it. It's the now moment. And furthermore, the now moment is accessed from a Taoist secret perspective in an insight of reality. Reality, basically, to a Taoist, is the bellows. Everything is contracting and expanding at the same time. You are all things and nothing at the same time. The very currency of your existence comes down to the breath in and the breath out. And to acquire that consciousness, that now moment, you enter the Wu Ji between the breath in and the breath out, which is what we call the primordial mother. Now, this sounds very woo-woo to a lot of people. It sounds like some deep diving into a mystical, esoteric sort of practices. But furthermore, when you water it down, you come across things that have been tools of very conscious manipulation that I'm not a fan of, but I teach people. Have you ever heard of NLP before?
No, I haven't. What does that
So
stand for?
NLP is neuro linguistic programming. So
Hmm.
no longer are the days of, oh, you got to be hypnotized and look into my eyes and watch the pendulum. That kind of stuff went out with Mesmer back in the 1800s when it was coined as a state of trance.
Hmm.
Neuro-linguistic programming is a very powerful tool that a godfather of that who's been making billions of dollars for many decades. You may be familiar with a guy by the name of what's his name? Tony Robbins.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
he has been using NLP for about 40 years, ever since it was created by a hypnotist and a psychologist and a therapist. It was like a union of these three came together and realized the power of linguistics and what that does and how to enter into the unconscious mind. So when you speak on things of tragedy or trauma that are very clear evidence of that, and it's at a visceral level where you can recall it in your mind and experience it as if it happened right now and it might have been 20 years ago, these are very clear states that now, and Taoist practices, I've been teaching people this for decades. Furthermore, they're ancient practices that are tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of years old. But I would say a contemporary offering of something that you can instantly access and erase a PTSD inside of someone that may have had it for 30, 40 years. It'll be gone in 30 seconds.
With
And
NLP.
people freak out. People freak out because these are tools that in the wrong hands, and I'm not stressing on fear because I don't believe in that. As a Taoist, we use the decipher of reality is the yin and yang, right? You mentioned the center point. We talk very clearly that everything has a center point of energy. Furthermore, the Vesica point is the overlapping of yin and yang, and that is the true essence of the unified state that is whole, not separate, not electromagnetic. These sound like very mystical, esoteric pathways to self-realization. But when I witness physical healings or, teach someone things like spoon bending, using your consciousness to alter the material in the state, you have to be no place, no person, no thing. The identity cannot be present. You cannot be playing with the idea that I believe in this and I call in my guides and my angels. And, you hear a lot of this, new age spiritual mumbo jumbo. No. To access this, there is an absolute method that has been repeated over and over and over and over again handed down from generation to generation within Taoism. That's why people gravitate to Taoist practices because of that, right? But that was erased by Ming or Mao back in the 1950s when he literally performed genocide on 60 million of his citizens. There, furthermore, any forms of religion, any ancient practices he erased, embodying or taking on the Western perception of medicine. And it took very, very short order to realize that there's nothing more powerful than the indigenous practices that he eradicated, meaning destroyed all Taoist temples, all Taoist teachers like myself, priests, erased it off the face of the earth, then came to realize one of his cabinet members had cancer, and he sought out the last two medical Qigong practitioners, Taoist alchemists, that actually healed that cabinet member using energy, because everything is energy. So, simplicity of Qigong, Tai Chi, these are the things that I teach people, Bagua. These are forms of harnessing energy and infusing it at a subatomic level within your physical flesh. But again, we'll go right back to what's really the focal point of why we're here, is that fasting element and how that sparks that actual realization that all of a sudden I'm getting back to normalcy. I in my mind, I was told, as society had told me, I need to eat 3 to 5 meals a day, small meals, this, that, all this kind of stuff. If you want to observe wellness, take a child. I have 6 children of my own, anywhere from 12 to 9 months. And all I do is my children wake up, and whenever they desire sustenance, they tell my wife or I would like to eat some food. Normally, what'll happen is they'll wake up at 6 or 7 in the morning and they won't even realize they need something to eat, or even it's the notion of, I don't even think they really need it, but it might be 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And that is their generally first and only meal. And that's how you harness this endocrine system and regulate the magic that goes inside this human body when you start to identify that you eat for wellness, not for sickness. And people don't realize this programming, because it is a programming. Most 99% of people are being brainwashed on a daily basis through manipulation, i.e., NLP, other linguistic programming that comes into being able to create your perception of reality. It's not your perception, it's someone else's perception, but you're living out through the programming this stuff. And so it's crazy when I can, show someone, hey, look, you're really running off someone else's ideas of what they think the reality of the world is. And people are like, what are you talking about? I have my own thoughts. I have my own belief systems. And I'll do something like this. And then I'll be, oh, okay, what was that? I said, now I want you to think of something, just anything. And I'll be like, okay, now tell me what that is in your mind. And I'll be like, it's an apple. Really? Did you conjure that up in your own mind? And I'll be like, yeah. And then I'll open my hand. And right in the corner of my hand, in micro letters, is the word apple. That's how fast you can incept someone's unconscious behavior. And furthermore, to get compliance, if you want to start playing with things like hypnosis, which I think everyone needs to start with. Now, the indigenous stuff I'm talking about goes way beyond the frequency of the simplicity of conscious and unconscious process. That's baseline infantile stuff. But everyone, I believe, should understand the fundamentals of the hypnotic state, the trance, and furthermore, how linguistics will lead you in that way, because this brings us back to your faith, your belief system, Greek Orthodoxy, your path of righteousness with your connection with divinity, God, whatever it is. You are resonating to that. You don't even have to understand. You might say, oh, my parents showed it to me and I've lived that my whole life. No, when you are in communion, in a state of worship, you feel it. You're like, this is right for me, because it's happening at a subatomic level. Your DNA is made up of letters, words, numbers, symbols integrated into it. You are just reflecting of what a neuroscientist would say, the mirroring effects of that, the somatic, visceral effects of that word or that state that is giving you an energetic charge. Just like how it's starting to come over your physical body, you're having an aha moment right now. You're going, oh, I need to look deeper into this. This is giving me more inquiry and insight into something that can expand on my knowing of who I am. And that's really what people don't understand. It's like, this is happening all the time. If you want to get down to conscious and unconscious, some people claim you have anywhere from 200 to 300,000, thoughts, or you take in 300,000 pieces of information on a daily basis. And you are aware of 7 and you retain 2. This is going on all day long. So how you master that is first creating that imperium, that command of what this is, and identifying what is conscious and unconscious, because this is why most people fail. As you said, human beings are like, it's a tragedy because they get caught up in this toxic consumption of self-destruction, whether it's referencing that ACE study that you talked about, where they were identifying trauma, which is basically a thought, feeling, and an emotion encapsulated into a timeline of what that person's reality is, and it's in their body viscerally. It's commanding their attention. That's a fact. And to unravel it, it's quite simple. It's quite evident when you start getting into energetic potential. And I've seen thousands and thousands and thousands of incredibly profound moments of realization of people over the 30 years I've been doing this, that it happens very quickly, instantaneously. And all of a sudden they have command over what's going on in their reality. So when you get Johnny Smith who's sitting with you and you're listening to the fireworks going off, you're looking on the TV screen, oh my goodness, it's New Year's Eve of 2024, we're going into 2025, and you look around your room and everyone's cheering or in joy for a new year, and they go, I'm going to create a new job, I'm going to lose 20 pounds, I'm going to make $1 million. And then a week later, you see Johnny. He's in the park eating ice cream, drinking a 40, and as fat as he ever was as of 5 days ago. What happened, Johnny? I don't know. I just kind of, I guess I lost the interest, because on a conscious and unconscious. Now, measuring that is speculative, but I can tell you quite frankly, most people do not have dominion of their conscious state at 100%. So let's just say the variables from someone who's more a talking head within epigenetics, someone like Bruce Lipton, if you've ever heard of this guy, he would say, guess what? 5% consciously, 95% unconscious. That's how you operate. This autonomous behavior, autonomy, the infrastructure of stuff that you're not aware of that is going on all day, every day, breath, blood, everything. You are not in command of that consciously. It's just happening. What is that? Some people will call it the divine sense of knowing, that this is the operation of something greater than you. But you can actually command an awareness of that and enter that and have dominion over it when you understand how to cultivate these practices to develop a brainwave that gives you the ability to do that. And you do it at will. And some entry levels, some people will speak on things like meditation, mindfulness, simplicity of these things into greater levels of awareness. Now, you couple that with fasting, and my friend, you're going to become superhuman and probably look like you. You look like you're 14 years old. So these things are working out very effectively for you, and you have inquiry and discovery of your spiritual path of knowing. But most commonly, the biggest problem with a lot of this stuff, all of it actually, I'm finding there's this revolution of experiential moments. People want to experience their experiences. Enough of the talk. Me, I'm an 80s guy. I don't know whether you remember this, but in the 80s, they had this thing called the Pepsi Challenge. You ever heard of that?
No.
Okay, look it up.
Okay,
Pepsi Challenge is my thing. I'm a show me guy. Shit or get off the pot. I will show you evidence of how profound it is to access your consciousness and affect change and healing instantaneously. Enough of the propagated propaganda of the nonsense of the mind where people talk about this and it's this and that. And no, show me. When someone is in the presence of your confidence and your knowing of who you are, you may or not be aware of it, but there's solace. There's a point of where you are grounded and create a homeostasis because they feel your white coat, your title gives them hope and a sense of knowing that I'm going to be okay. And it may not be complete resolve. This goes back to the mirroring effect, right? So they're mirroring. So, for example, one of the classic ones within mirroring would be the 4-minute mile in history. Someone hits a 4-minute mile threshold that hasn't been done in decades, and all of a sudden, 1, 2, 5 days after that, hundreds of people were hitting the 4-minute mile. Because that's all it takes. Evidence of mirroring effect would be you're in a stadium, in an audience, you're watching a football game, a concert, and you feel this incredible wave of energy that comes over you that is a unified connection that you have with the crowd. Yes. And this is on a much deeper level. I would use mirroring effect to something like I cheat a little bit. So when my kids go, it's story time, I want to go to bed. How I use mirroring is quite simple because I've been mastered in the frequency for many decades, right? I teach people, I transmit this frequency. So when my kids are like, it's story time. And then my wife goes, oh, Dad's going to tell, oh, no, I don't want that. What do you mean? Because I will start with once upon a time. And then I will start replicating the youngest child's breath. And once I mirror that, I connect with that. I connect with all the other kids. And then I take a deep breath in. I drop them down, and they're all asleep in a few seconds. And daddy's back to basically Netflix or whatever else I want to watch. This is the mirroring effect that you have and the power.
Interesting.
Over that. There's a lot of different facets. So, you adding fasting as, in my opinion, the most powerful tool for anyone to realize the power of themselves instantaneously within literally moments. Because when you're really sick, you're going to see the side effect within hours. I'm feeling nauseous. I'm not getting hungry. I'm feeling sick. Like there's something purging from me that needs to be purged. And once they get past a certain threshold, normally from me, if we're a newbie, after 12 hours, they're like, I thought I was going to be hungry. I'm actually becoming more and more energized and more full. And within 24 hours, I'm not even hungry anymore. Now, of course, you want to nurture that and make sure that they have a balance of electrolytes and other things so that they're not being deficient. But generally speaking, you do a clip of that for, 72 hours, and you're not going to recognize yourself. You're going to be like, holy crap, what was I thinking of? What was I doing? And then you break the cherry. Go ahead, share more.
No, well said. I mean, exactly. You might be supplementing electrolytes and water, but you're not supplementing with regular snacking and sugar and whatnot. So it speaks to the same theme that you're trying to support fasting, not hamper it or destroy the effort that goes into that. I mean, speaking to your point from earlier, imagine, like I said, you start fasting at the age of 7. And before you even know what delayed gratification is, self-sacrifice, discipline, dominion over yourself, you're just kind of doing this. I mean, it's sort of the ultimate apprenticeship. And, I think many times before we understand something, we have to act it out. And so, this idea that we can start fasting at such a young age before we have that cognitive understanding, that intellectual appreciation, it doesn't really matter. In fact, in some ways, it's even a deeper distillation of what we're trying to understand eventually. It's like you're just doing it. And so that eventually, maybe later on in life, you become more self-aware as to why that is or how that occurs. But now it's really part of your core. And one of the reasons I brought up this ACE study as well earlier was to say that if I can ruin your life at a young age by decades, I can also extend your life at a young age, right? And so in some ways, this fasting practice is just so brilliant because it shows you the high stakes nature of the game and what can be done at such a formative age. And so, yeah, I mean, if we can have children distill and really absorb what that's all about, that's a virtue. Like, virtue will save you. Virtue will make your life better. Virtue will extend your life. It will change society. It will change the world. And I think that this practice of fasting is just so brilliant. I mean, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's when God was trying to test Adam and Eve. Okay, we're just talking about the story here, but when God was trying to test human beings, he didn't tell them not to murder, say a certain word, don't have sex, don't do certain things. He used food as the first test. And I think embodied in that is a proxy for all other manner of sin or vice, however you want to call it. And it's just not a coincidence in my mind because it's so, as you say, visceral, internal, central. And so from this one test, boom, they failed it. And what ends up happening? All manner of evil eventually. But how did God go about picking that act? I mean, it didn't have to be a fruit of a tree. It could have just been something else. But there's something in the engineering that's so visceral and central and deep within us that's where all else begins. That was the singular event. And so that's why I go back to saying that fasting is no coincidence that fasting is so universal, so practiced in so many different places, and frankly, now probably mostly forgotten, unfortunately. But it's a powerful tool. It's a powerful tool, and it's not a coincidence that it has such an impact on so many facets of our lives. As I mentioned again, you have this ACE study showing what's at stake if things go wrong, and then I can show you through fasting what's at stake when we can make things go right. And I wish I lived in a society where everyone fasted. I think that would be a good society. It would be a beautiful society, a healthy society. And a lot of my work is looking into, primary, secondary, tertiary effects of that commitment. And the Athos diet itself is positioned to show best practices, but in an age of faithlessness, or an age where we're so disconnected from where we came from, sometimes you have to show it through the science that, hey, this is something we shouldn't forget. So that's the sort of the tip of the iceberg, really, in the time that we spent together of suggesting why fasting is a practice I, as a medical doctor, really have tried to better understand, and why me as a individual, as a Greek Orthodox Christian, as a spiritual being participating in humanity, is reaching back to that practice, because I think it's just so high yield and so central to us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fascination and the commitment that people have to fasting is result, right? When I was dieting within my bodybuilding years, all this toxicity comes out through the breath, or it comes out through, poop. It's really coming down to the simplicity, the skin. You're going to disperse this stuff in one way, shape, or form, but the result was immediate. I will see the muscle tissue start to expand. I see this thinning of the skin, and it gets super exciting when you wake up and you're in one physical state, and by the end of the day, you've transformed again. By the time you wake up the next day, you're in a completely different condition. You see veins coming out within the skin layer as you start to get rid of that visceral fat that is around the organs, within the muscle tissue. And then you start to go, holy moly, there is result. And that's why this hetero action of human beings having to start what they finish. And furthermore, I'd give people an exercise to validate that. Go up and shake someone's hand and watch them automatically mirror what it is that you're offering. And it will be very much a hard sell not to have someone just immediately shake your hand, because they're programmed that way. Now, if you're trying to enter someone's unconscious mind, that's the first start, is compliance. By the time you ask them their name and they validated that, by the third notion, you're already able to enter their unconscious. It's just about complying. So then all of a sudden, they start listening to everything that you say as validated information. They start believing it. Now, you don't have to go, oh, do you believe me now? No, you're already receiving that data. And it just comes with a dominoes effect of compliance, where it normally comes in groups of 3. And by the third access, and you're having them validate it for themselves, even though you're not telling them that's what you're doing, that then turns into basically programming how you perceive reality. So that hetero action, if you want to test it for yourself, go and open a door and see how compelled you are to close it. See how compelled you are that you must complete the action. You must finish it. This is part of the dualism that we experience within the electromagnetic spectrum. With one, as you said, people that are fascinated by pain. Within pain, there is suffering. Within suffering, there is relief. And ultimately, there is what someone would consider good or bad, up or down. These are evidence that you are experiencing this electromagnetic spectrum. You are the now moment. You are in a dualistic reality. And so you will have to, you're compelled to close it. It's part of your programming. And you must step beyond that as you have more self-inquiry, more discovery, more understanding of these facets, and you'll become more clear that you have Imperium. You are commanding what's going on. And that's part of why I always tell people method is so very important to your own journey of self-realization, is having a method. And when you play in the energetic potential, this becomes realized, because you can validate. It's not a fleeting moment of a thought. You can measure it with this energy potential and have it realized as something more than just a passing thought in your mind. And that's the separation. And that would be my healthy conversation about someone who likes to argue the position of psychology. Personally, within the test of time, psychology was designed to separate you from yourself. Because if you access an autonomous process that you don't believe is possible, because that's just the stuff science tells me is, oh, it just happens regardless. Well, why does it happen regardless? What is going on that no matter what you're breathing, no matter what blood is flowing in your body, and you should be able to access that autonomic nervous system and have control over it, which is part of what this is.
San, you are a fascinating person. I would love to have more rounds of exchange with you, and I can definitely see why these discussions about so many important topics that demand time end up taking a lot of time. And I'm so appreciative you've given me much of yours. San, thank you very much. And I really hope that this is not our last discussion. It's been actually
I will offer you round 2 at any time you like, my dear friend. I would like to explore more and create a library of these conversations so you can put your experience, your insight, your mastery in a digital offering that we can log here at Consciousness of the Way, this podcast, and have people be able to refer to our conversation. Because my disciple students, 126's subscribers to this channel, they welcome these conversations because they're visceral. This is like an exercise that they're experiencing. They're not just hearing people talk about ideas. They experience the visceral, like the visceral charge you're getting. This is the knowing. That chill, that expansion is the knowing. And, and sometimes it creeps people out. They go, oh, how do you know that? It's like, this is part of the sensory perception. It's all part of it. And it doesn't have to be anything you fear. If anything, you want to explore it more for your own mastery. And I'm more than happy to expand on it and give you a few directive points that you can expand on your own cultivation if you choose to. It's not necessary. I have dear friends that are Buddhist monks that cannot stand energy. They can't handle it. They go, I'm sitting here in my incarnation, my reincarnation, whatever you want to call it, observing dukkha, right? And I'm like, dukkha? Dukkha is, in definition within a Buddhist path, the distortion, the emotional content, the noise, and that it irritates them when they identify with the energy potential. It's like, I don't want to feel it. I just want to observe the distortion and stay still. Everyone has their own thing, I mean, for me, I get excited by witnessing physical, mental, emotional, spiritual healing. That's what I'm here for. That's what excites me. That's part of my programming. And I replicate it on a daily basis, just as you have all the things that excite you, going around the world, experiencing all these spiritual sights and feeling the presence of something divine that has been cultivated there over thousands of years. It's undeniable. You're in the presence of it. And, then that goes into more things like body dowsing and things of that nature, where I teach people how to identify power centers, ley lines, vortices, and you use yourself using what we call ideomotor response, which is another form of divinity, which was coined back in the 1800s by someone that gives you a clear understanding, like using a pendulum, dowsing prongs, tarot cards, Ouija boards. You are having information passing through your physical body. Now, you can ignore it or not. It's happening. How you command that and what you do with it can help you get a greater understanding of your sense of what reality is. And that's where you start defining those energetic potentials. But I want to thank you, my dear friend. And we are having a part 2, part 3, part 5. Whenever you have time, I will reach out to you after this podcast. I'm going to put all your information under this podcast, where they can find you in the social sphere within the interweb, where you can merge with Dr. Pete's understanding and insight and mastery, not just from the medical aspect, but furthermore spiritual awareness and integrating those two things. So I want to thank you, my dear friend. Is there anything you want to share with the audience in closing, or?
No, I just appreciate their time and want to say that the stakes are high, and we have a tool that's free a tool that's universal, and it's something I think that is just a force for good. So why not use it? It's there's just too much at stake, and I think our discussion is just fascinating, actually. But just sort of teasing out some of that underlying philosophy and energy that surrounds that, I think it's really, really interesting, and it's a universe of it's a territory I continue to look at, expand into, and enjoy every time I flip another rock in that journey. So it's been really good. Thanks, Len.
Beautiful. Last question. What's your definition of spiritual consciousness?
Wow. I mean, I think we're conscious, but I think it's up to us as to whether or not we want to be conscious with God. And I think that spiritual consciousness is in the Orthodox tradition. God became man so we could become gods. There's actually a belief of theosis, where we truly become one with Him. And so I think that's what spiritual consciousness. We could be conscious, but we can be quite asleep in regards to being a part of something that's really responsible for everything that we are. So that's my first pass at that one.
Beautiful. We're going to explore all of that and more on our next podcast. Thank you, my dear friend. I'm very grateful to have you in my human sphere, and discovering and creating a relationship, helping people discover these ancient practices and more insight into furthermore your experience in all those things. So I want to thank you. I want to thank the universe for bringing you into my life. I want to thank the audience for sharing their time with us today. I am your humble servant and seafood, Taoist Master San Qing, and I'll see you on the next one, guys.